Hello everyone, and welcome to my brand new series that I am officially calling Rare and Obscure Nintendo. And hopefully future me remembers to put that Nintendo in, so this part looks really cool. Or not. As the name suggests for the series, we're going to be looking into lost, obscure, and just generally rare Nintendo kind of media and stuff that you guys may not be familiar with. First few episodes are going to be going into like consoles and peripherals such as Satellaview, Famicom Disk System, the Virtual Boyo, N64DD, which we're talking about today. But later on, I'd like to go into series themselves, and maybe even Sonic stuff, even though it's not rare and obscure Nintendo, but there's a lot of weird Sonic stuff. I'm gonna stop talking about it before I get too carried away, but expect that, maybe. Long story short, we'll kind of get into that other stuff later on. We'll see how this series goes, but I am personally really looking forward to it, and I hope you guys are too. And so, without further ado, let's go ahead and take a look at the Nintendo 64 DD. So, before we get started, let me give you guys a crash course on what the N64DD was. Unlike a lot of the items on this list, the N64DD as a console was actually released, though not a lot of people could get their hands on this console for a number of reasons. These reasons included the add-on not being available in anywhere outside of Japan, and the add-on not being available to purchase in an actual store. Rather, you had to get it through mail order through a payment plan. There's also the fact that it was pretty expensive for the time, and that it was in development purgatory, essentially, for a very long time. So long, in fact, that the N64DD was meant to come out before the Dreamcast initially, and if it did, it would have been the first add-on console peripheral device that would have been able to use the internet. In the mid to late 90s, this was huge. While Nintendo did have satellite capabilities for the Super Famicom with the Satellaview add-on, the internet itself was not something that was tapped upon until the N64DD. And unfortunately, it was a little late to the party by the time it actually came out and saw a release. The N64DD used floppy disks, which aren't exactly advanced nowadays, but back then they did a lot more than the average N64 cartridge could do at the time. There are a variety of ways that this made the games more advanced in regards to the standard N64 cartridge, which we'll get into as we talk about the actual games on this list. Starting at the very beginning, Nintendo first announced the N64DD at the 1995 Shoshinkai Trade Show, which was later known as the Space World Trade Show. At this point in time, Nintendo was very into the concept of the N64DD and said they would launch it by the end of 1996. Despite Nintendo wanting to get the N64DD out fairly quickly, probably due to the competition found in the PS1, there weren't any specs given on what this thing could actually do. And that's likely due to the fact that the console wasn't actually seen physically until the very next year in 1996 at Shoshinkai 1996. Also, real quick fun fact for ya, if it's fun, whatever, it's a fact, but it was nicknamed Bulky Drive when it was still in development. Like, the GameCube had the Dolphin, and Ultra 64 was the Nintendo 64, N64DD got Bulky Drive, so that should probably say a lot about the prospective outcome that this console add-on thingy eventually had. Which, in my opinion, is a huge shame. From what I've personally seen from the software developed for the N64DD, which we'll get into that pretty quickly in just a little bit, I promise, this console seemed really before its time and pretty advanced. But to really abridge what happened with the N64DD, essentially what happened is it was delayed a ton of times and wasn't actually released until very late in the N64's life cycle, which ended up being December 1st of 1999, and it was discontinued in February 28th of 2001. The add-on was teased in Western and Japanese publications and such, even at E3, but because of it being consistently delayed and nothing really being shown physically in a lot of these presentations, most notably E3, It just never really came to fruition, and when it did, it was a little too late. In the end, this add-on only sold 15,000 units in Japan. Even by Japan numbers, that's really small and contributes to why it's so rare and so expensive today. Because of this, ultimately, the console add-on, I keep saying console, had a lot of great games planned for it that either never saw the light of day or just never were released at all. And that, my friends, is what we're going to get into right now. And if you guys want to see a more comprehensive history of the N64DD as a console add-on, then definitely check out the Gaming Historian video on it. I'll also link in the description other great videos that talk about the add-on itself. In this video, we're just gonna kinda dive deep into the really obscure games that were never released or just kinda really rare and not really known about too much in the Nintendo community. With that said, let's go ahead and get started in all the weird and obscure games I have in this video. So yeah, let's get started. In the late 90s, virtual pets were all the rage. Whether it was a Tamagotchi, Digimon, or VMU Chow, digital pets came a dime a dozen. While life sim games were also very popular at the time, virtual pets truly took the concept a step further with allowing the player to take full control of a digital pet and how it would grow and appear depending on how well they took care of it. It was at this time when Nintendo decided to take an innovative and advanced approach to this concept with a little-known project known as Cabbage. This project, described by Wikipedia as an, breeding sim, was created as a prototype but unfortunately never saw the light of day. The game was intended to release in the late 90s, as it was formally announced in 1997, though ultimately remained in development for 5 years before being cancelled. 3 big names in Nintendo worked on the Cabbage prototype. This included Shigesato Itoi, Tsunekazu Ishihara, and Shigeru Miyamoto. Cabbage was described as popular with the Nintendo staff and implemented a lot of features that were seen in later Nintendo releases. This included a real-time clock that allowed your Cabby Cab to grow while the player was away from the game, and the ability to transfer that Cabbagey boy over to the Game Boy. See what I did there? Something that was also seen in later Pokemon games and even the Chow Garden in Sonic Adventure DX and 2 Battle. And while on that topic, this was also seen in the original Dreamcast games with the VMU, so with that considered, Cabbage could have been a competitor in that regard if the game did end up seeing a release. I mean, who knows, if Cabbage did end up coming out in some form, we may be yelling at Nintendo to bring back Cabbage, just like Sega Sonic fans yell at Sega to bring back the Chow Garden. Please bring back the Chow Garden, Sega, I'm begging you. Cabbage was far enough in development to where we knew what this kind of implementation with the Game Boy would be called, as in interviews it was referred to as a basket. While it is still currently unknown what the game prototype looks like, as well as designs and concept art, it likely would have had a lot of potential considering the creators of Earthbound, Pokemon, and Mario Zelda were all working on this together. Though, unfortunately, this would also end up contributing to the game's ultimate cancellation as Itoi and Ishihara became engrossed in other projects and were simply unable to make Cabbage work. Due to this, game development slowed until coming to a complete halt. Miyamoto himself personally spoke very highly of the project, and Cabbage was mentioned in a number of gaming magazines. These publications referred to Cabbage as a sophisticated Tamagotchi and too good to be true. The latter unfortunately being somewhat true with the game's cancellation, but not completely. We'll get to that part in a second, as like I said, there are a few video games made by Nintendo that do have some similar features that Cabbage was intended to have. The game was planned to have a playable demo at Space World 2000, though that unfortunately never happened as the demo never surfaced in any form. For those of you who don't know, Space World, formerly referred to as Shoshinkai and Famicom Space World, was a 3-day trade show hosted by Nintendo that occurred annually between 1989 and 2001. Space World revealed most big Nintendo consoles released over that time period, as well as many big first-party titles. Space World, or rather the history of Space World, is a topic I plan to cover in a future video. While Cabbage never saw the light of day, not all is lost. Many of the concepts developed for this unreleased simulation title were eventually repurposed in future Nintendo games. This is most blatantly seen in the Nintendogs games, as they are known to use a lot of concepts used in Cabbage. While the pet care element is the most obvious, of course, adding items and toys to your pet's living space was also a concept that carried over, as items and additional content were intended to be released in sets and shareable via floppy disks through the N64DD's floppy drive, of course. In addition, the internal clock feature was brought over the Animal Crossing, which was implemented in the very first game, Dobutsu no Mori, released only in Japan on the Nintendo 64 in 2001. This was only 1 year after Cabbage's intended Space World demo. A real-time clock was also used in Pokemon Gold and Silver and remains a staple of many games to this day. It would be very cool to at least see a glimpse of what Cabbage looked like and played like before its cancellation. Because this wasn't an already established first-party title, we really have no idea what this game was and what it could have been. Aside from the Tamagotchi thing, of course. It's kind of like hearing about the concept of Splatoon and the gameplay, but never actually seeing any visuals or anything on the game itself. You wouldn't really know what the game would look like just from getting brief descriptions and such. It's kind of a mystery to me for that reason. This is one of the many lost and cancelled video games that I'd love to see something of the most. Maybe it's just because I love simulation games, but Cabbage seemed like such a cool idea, and it had so much potential. If you're a Metroid fan and you think you have it pretty rough, then allow me to introduce you to the Earthbound fandom. I mean, sure, waiting for Metroid Prime 4's warm and long-awaited embrace is rough, but it sure is better than never getting Mother 3 localized, ever, and still waiting for Earthbound to pop up on NSO. Which it still hasn't as of the recording of this video. I mean, I'm not a huge fan of either series. I'm playing Mother 3 right now and it's pretty good, but believe me when I say that I really do feel for you guys despite not being a huge fan of Metroid or Earthbound. Anyways, what were we talking about? Oh right, Earthbound 64. Earthbound 64, which is formally known in Japan as Mother 3 Fall of the Pig King, is a cancelled Nintendo 64 game that was planned as the third game in the Mother series. While Mother 3 eventually did see a release on the Game Boy Advance, this Nintendo 64 equivalent was a lot more expansive and ambitious than the one that eventually did come out. Among these ambitious intended features was the possible ability to have 12 playable characters over 12 chapters, meaning that each character would get their own chapter. Putting this in perspective in regards to current RPG standards, specifically stuff like Persona 5, you had a max party at one point of 10 characters including the main playable character. This is on a PS4 game that is years later, so attempting to cram 12 characters into an N64DD game is pretty ambitious. And while I did say Fall of the Pig King was the title or part of the title of Mother 3 at this point, there was also another potential title being Forest of the Chimera. Both of these translate to Mother 3 as it was released eventually, and the full title of Mother 3 was changed multiple times over the process of its development. And when I say development process, I really do mean it was a very lengthy process, as this game was intended to be on the Nintendo 64 DD in 1999, and eventually was ultimately released on the Game Boy Advance in 2006. At one point, Mother 3 was even intended to be brought over to the GameCube. And while, yes, I can go on for a very long time about the development of Mother 3 as a whole, we're going to be focusing on that Nintendo 64 DD version. So let's start at the very beginning, and by beginning I mean the actual gameplay of Earthbound or Mother 2 itself. You see, there's actually an in-game reference to Mother 3 or Earthbound 2, as it's referenced in the English version, which suggests that the game was actually in development or at least planned at this point in time. Mother 3 was originally intended to be on the SNES using Donkey Kong Country-like graphics, though that was quickly scrapped due to the SNES being near the end of its life cycle. This is when development on the 64DD began. Not only was Mother 3 intended to be 12 chapters long, but the story was also meant to take place over a span of 10 years. Mother 3 was also meant to take place 10 years after Earthbound or Mother 2 in the year 2000X. Among the biggest changes of Mother 3 as far as the finished product and the N64DD variant is that the game was meant to be a lot darker than it ended up being. Among the darker elements we know of is the original intention for the final boss having no dialogue and the experience replicating a nightmare. Other elements of the story being changed included a very slow build-up that slowly allowed the player to fully realize what made the world the way it was. Regarding this element of the story, Shigesato Itoi, who is the creator of the Mother series, stated, "There's a strange world that you can't quite decipher between Middle Ages or the Old West. And, in the end, you realize the circumstances of what made it so strange. It was made in a way that you'd be thinking, this is weird, then make it through chapter 11, and hit chapter 12 and scream, this is terrible." Other changes include Flint, Lucas's father, being playable for a longer duration of the game, a minecart scene taking place in the spectacular cave, and Klaus, Lucas's brother, looking a lot more like Ness from Earthbound or Mother 2. So, apparently Mother 3 was a very special case with Nintendo as it wasn't required to be greenlit and the producers and creators of Earthbound or Mother 2 just went straight to developing Mother 3. This apparent advantage ended up being somewhat of a disadvantage as the people who worked on Earthbound or Mother 2 were not experienced in making 3D games, so the transition was quite a challenge. At this point in time in Japan, the economy was not doing very well. Due to this, HAL Laboratories wasn't able to afford training that would benefit the development team of Mother 3. Though, in an attempt to help the team with 3D graphics, the team that worked on Pokémon Stadium was brought on to assist. Ultimately, this allowed Nintendo to provide a playable demo at Space World 1999. And at this point, Earthbound 64 or Mother 3 was delayed to March 22nd of 2000. Unfortunately, it was not long after Space World 1999 when Mother 3 or Earthbound 64 was cancelled. The project was officially cancelled on August 21st of 1999. Prior to the cancellation of Earthbound 64, the team went to great lengths to try and make this game work and accommodate for it. This included shortening the game to make it available on cartridge for the original Nintendo 64. At this point, the game was shortened from 12 chapters to only 9. Following this, the Game Boy Advance release of Mother 3 would only be 8 chapters. At the time of Earthbound 64's cancellation, it was speculated to be only 30% complete. This information came from a statement by Satoru Iwata. Shigeru Miyamoto, on the other hand, believed that this game was about 60% complete when considering programming and the script. In addition to this, available footage of the Space World 1999 demo offers a look at what this game could have been. While at this point, the footage of the Space World demo and these screenshots and music are all we really have to go off of, it's a real shame that Mother 3 was never able to be released in 3D. While Mother 3 on the Game Boy Advance is still an excellent game from what I've played so far, this somewhat darker 3D incarnation of the game looks like it could have been a lot more expansive and just so much more to experience. Hey, remember how I said that Earthbound fans have it pretty rough? When, I was, talking about Earthbound 64? Well, the F-Zero fandom has just entered the chat, folks, and they aren't too happy either. But with the last official F-Zero release being a Japan-only title in 2004, one that was on the Game Boy Advance that, from what I heard, isn't very good, can you really blame them? And speaking of Japan-only F-Zero releases, because F-Zero fans, of course, and Nintendo 64 disk drive, of course, also, allow me to cordially introduce the F-Zero X expansion kit. And funnily enough, unlike the majority of 64DD games, this title actually got released, which is neat. The F-Zero X expansion kit was released in April of 2000 and is basically an add-on to the N64 game F-Zero X that was released in July of 1998. So, what did the expansion kit expand upon? For starters, it provided 12 new tracks to race on. There was also enhanced audio and more storage space. The most interesting elements, however, are the car editor and track editor. The car editor lets the player build a car with pre-made parts and edit the stats as they please. Kind of like an advanced version of building your own kart in Mario Kart 8. You can test your car out as well. The track editor, however, is the real meat in the meal here. Like, you know when you bite into a jelly donut and all that filling just comes spilling out? Or like, the same thing, but when you bite into a cream puff? Or a cannoli? Well, the track editor is that gushy filling. If you like pastries with gushy filling, that is. The really cool thing about the track editor is that it gives the player access to the same tools and course elements that the developers of the game likely had. It's like Mario Maker but for F-Zero. Everything considered, it's a really cool expansion pack that was probably really mind-blowing to players at the time. Other than Mario Kart, there really isn't any big racing titles made by Nintendo, unless someone out there is really super into, I don't know, Stunt Racer FX. But my point here is that F-Zero satisfies a kind of niche consumer that wants more intense racing out of a video game that Mario Kart might not provide unless you're like upping the CCs and doing the F-Zero course that is literally the only thing F-Zero fans have in the modern era of gaming to kind of, you know, satisfy them. But, you know, it'd be cool if F-Zero came back is my main point. It's a very overlooked series and I'd love to see it come back even though I'm not a huge fan. But yeah, to conclude, F-Zero X expansion kit, it is something that was released and made available, but 64DD, you know, it's a very expensive console to obtain and collect for, so it might be a little difficult to, you know, check that out yourself, but there is plenty of video footage of it online, so, you know, knock yourself out with that if you want to check it out. It's very, very cool. While having an internet browser on your game console isn't a big deal nowadays, it was incredibly advanced for the year 1999. Heck, I remember being absolutely ecstatic when I got an internet browser game cartridge for my original gray DS. I was finally able to read Poke-shipping fanfiction without other people potentially seeing and questioning my life choices. Wait, no, I didn't say that. Let's move on. So, to put this into perspective, this is what computers typically look like in the year 1999. And this is what web pages look like. And online gaming through a game console did exist, though it wasn't nearly as popular and mainstream as it became in the mid-2000s. The earliest case of a home console with online functionality was actually the Sega Saturn. It had a web browser add-on called Sega Net Link, and allowed web browsing way back in 1996. Later on, there was also SegaNet on the Dreamcast. It worked with a large number of games for the console. I still think it actually does work on some games today. Though, despite all of this, the idea of online gaming was still pretty niche as well as expensive to maintain on a gaming console. This is especially true when it came to the N64DD's Randnet service. Launched alongside the N64DD hardware, Randnet was an online service that allowed web browsing as well as online support for two confirmed games, those being Mario Artist Communication Kit and Japan Pro Golf Tour 64. There are also a few other titles listed on the Nintendo Wiki, but I don't know if these had online functionality for sure because some of the information and dates on this article don't really add up, so, it's there though. The online service was provided by a Japanese media company known as Recruit, and the partnership occurred right after Nintendo ended their partnership with St. Giga. St. Giga is a satellite radio company that went under in 2003 and helped Nintendo with the Satellaview service, which is on the Super Famicom. We'll get to that in another episode. Those who purchased the 64DD apparently also had to subscribe to Randnet as well, as a mandatory subscription was included in the whole package. This meant that less people were probably interested in buying the 64DD than they already were at this point. But, on the other hand, this also meant that everyone who owned a 64DD also had access to Randnet, which made the forums apparently very popular. What are these forums, you may be asking? Well, we're gonna get into that right now because there were a lot of features in the Randnet service that are pretty before their time as far as 90s standards. For starters, Randnet came in a starter kit with everything needed to surf the web, as the cool kids said back in the day. This kit included the 64DD itself, the N64 modem, which was connected through a cartridge slot on top of the N64 itself, an expansion pack which allowed an extra 4 megabytes of RAM in addition to the N64's original 4 megabytes of RAM, so in total the 64DD would have 8 megabytes of RAM. And last, but certainly not least, was the Randnet Browser disk, which allowed the users to, of course, access Randnet and the internet, and, all the members-only cool things that were available on it. The Randnet service offered a plethora of options, and there were some available during the 64DD's life cycle, but there were also quite a few that were supposed to be eventually available, but ultimately cancelled. Either way, any and all features available at the time or not are now completely lost media, as Randnet was discontinued in early 2001. This was only a little bit over 1 year after its launch. All of the features made available through the service are now, unfortunately, inaccessible due to this, with the exception of the menu and any content that the users at the time when the service was active downloaded, like, email and stuff. This situation is unfortunately very similar to Satellaview, as a lot of online-only satellite games were made for the service that have never seen the light of day since then. But alas, at the very least we do know what features were supposed to be made available and were available back in the day of the 64DD. Released features included an editing tool to create custom avatars and interact with other users, online messaging boards and email where you could communicate with other Randnet users, an opportunity to actually swap messages with the game programmers and producers, internet surfing, which of course allowed you to surf the web, a feature in one of the Mario Artist games which allowed the player to create a virtual postcard and send it out through the internet, an online shopping service known as Get Mail service that sold CDs, books, magazines, even 64DD games and peripherals. And then the actual ability to read digital magazines through the 64DD service itself. This one was only partially released as it was intended to have the ability to check online sports scores, weather, and news, but only features related to horse racing were released. Which brings us to the impressive unreleased content. This included the possibility of NES games being emulated through the 64DD, a battle mode where you could play against other gamers and swap scores, an observation mode, which I would imagine would be pretty similar to spectating on Smash Bros. Online, or even viewing someone else's gameplay on PSN, or even Twitch streaming or something like that, so again, pretty before its time. There was also the intention of releasing betas of games that you could download from the online Randnet service and play before they were released. And then there was the unreleased music distribution feature, which would allow players to listen to music online and even listen to music that was unreleased in record stores as of that time. And so, if Randnet actually worked and became popular, this could have been NSO before NSO. And unfortunately, that is not what happened, as Nintendo had approximately 15,000 users at the end of the service's life cycle, which is really not a lot at all. With the official shutdown of Randnet on February 28th of 2001, this one advanced, innovative, yet brief era of online gaming came to a close. Later that year, on September 14th of 2001, the Nintendo GameCube was launched in Japan. And while not particularly known for its online functionalities, certain games supported LAN functionality like Mario Kart Double Dash, and the GameCube version of Phantasy Star Online could be played online with a broadband connection. The Japanese company ASCII, see, I pronounced it correctly this time, guys, even created this really cool GameCube controller keyboard. As far as Nintendo, online functionality on the same level as Randnet wouldn't be seen again on a Nintendo console until the Wii and DS era. Even then, those online browsers didn't do a lot of the things Randnet could do or was intended to do. But as it stands today, Randnet is a pretty cool piece of Nintendo history. Fire Emblem is a 30-year-old video game series with a respectable collection of games accumulated over the years. Despite that, did you know that the Nintendo 64 was the only home console to never have a Fire Emblem game released for it? Though, for the record, this is counting Tokyo Mirage Sessions as the Wii U release, since I personally feel it counts since it has Marth and is an RPG and stuff. I mean, if you don't count it, then Wii U counts too, but I personally do, and Tokyo Mirage Sessions is a really cool name, and why am I rambling? Anywho, I mean, there was a Fire Emblem game planned for the Nintendo 64, more specifically the N64DD, which, you know, that's why it's in the video, but it personally makes me really sad that there never was a Fire Emblem game on this console, a console I grew up with and loved dearly, because it just makes me sad. Fire Emblem Ankoku no Miko, better known today as Fire Emblem 64 within the fanbase, was officially confirmed to be in development in 1997. Though this was kind of a rocky road to the actual confirmation, and the whole deal around it being confirmed is kind of, well, to start, this game was announced officially by Shigeru Miyamoto, who really doesn't have much to do with the development of Fire Emblem, as Intelligent Systems is pretty much who works on those games. To put that in perspective, Game Freak, Game Freak to Pokemon is Intelligent Systems to Fire Emblem, and it's been that way for quite some time, I believe, since the very first game. Miyamoto officially announced the 64 equivalent of the Fire Emblems a year after Genealogy of the Holy War, but basically during this confirmation of Fire Emblem 64, Miyamoto said that development was progressing steadily at a fairly quickly rate and that the game would likely release shortly after Mario RPG 2. Which is the original title for the first Paper Mario game, and it was changed due to Square Enix issues due to the title, and just, that's a whole thing. Now, information regarding Fire Emblem 64 is fairly scarce, though it is speculated that a 3D Fire Emblem was considered since the launch of the Nintendo 64. Though there are conflicting reports on this, as the original creator of Fire Emblem, Shozo Kaga, didn't seem to be too interested in making games for anything other than the Super Famicom, even in the late 90s. As a matter of fact, Kaga himself would later leave Intelligent Systems and make a game very similar in nature to Fire Emblem. And so, following Miyamoto's announcement of this game, a Japanese magazine titled 64 Dream followed the development of the game, following the official announcement, of course. And remember that interview with Miyamoto that we were just talking about that said that Fire Emblem 64 would come out after Mario RPG 2? Well, it originated from Dengeki Mao magazine, which is a seinen magazine produced by ASCII. See how I pronounce it right that time? This article was later translated to English and published to IGN.com, which, at least to me, is kind of interesting, as Fire Emblem was pretty unknown to Nintendo fans at that time, at least in the West, unless they were pretty in touch with what was going on in Japan, and the first Fire Emblem game to come out in the West was the Blazing Blade, a few years later following the success of Smash Bros. Melee. Could this be alluding to some kind of hidden truth? Could this mean that Fire Emblem could have been localized way earlier in the N64 days? Years before the Blazing Blade, or Fire Emblem as it's known on the GBA release in the West, could the release and localization of Fire Emblem Anko no Miko have possibly reshaped and drastically changed the Fire Emblem series and continuity as we know it today? I don't know. Probably not. Also, did you know that there's this bonus disc that came with specific Mario Kart Double Dash pre-orders that had bonus items that could be transferred to the Blazing Blade Fire Emblem GBA? Like, it was a disc that had certain game demos and footage, but just happened to have, like, Fire Emblem items that you could transfer if you had the Fire Emblem game. And no, this has absolutely nothing to do with what we were just talking about, but it's interesting, I think. Okay, moving on. While there's not much known about Fire Emblem 64 as a game in itself, we do know these details, which I'll just, go ahead and list off for you right now. 1. It was going to be a mainline Fire Emblem game, same basic gameplay mechanics as previous mainline entries of freaking course, but I might as well list it. 2. The game's main protagonist was named Ike, but not that Ike, as he looked a lot like Roy. This is not a mere coincidence, however, as many characters and game elements were repurposed for the Blazing Blade and Binding Blade. I just confused them. The one with Roy. Most of the things were repurposed for the one with Roy, so that would be Binding Blade. Yep, Binding Blade. 3. Other characters found in the concept art of Fire Emblem 64 had the same names as characters from the Binding Blade, and look somewhat similar. The only character that was not rewritten in any way appears to be Karel, or Carol, as he's pretty much the same character as he is in, the Binding Blade. As far as all the other characters rewritten that have some presence in the Binding Blade, here they all are on the screen to save me from, butchering their names like I probably just did with Karel. I'll go ahead and give you a minute to look them over. Okay, next, while on that topic, Fire Emblem 64 used a few character names that were later given to different characters. This includes Ike, Eliwood, and Owain, though that last one is the localized name of a character known as Eudes, I believe, in the Japanese release of Awakening. 5. We also know that there is one single screenshot available of this game to look at. Well, there's only one screenshot released to the public. This screenshot was published in the 2015 book, The Making of Fire Emblem, 25th Anniversary, Development Secrets, Awakening, and If. And for those of you who don't know, If is the Japanese name for Fates. The 3DS games that gave you a whole lot of waifu and husbando options, as well as, well, mainly a lot of that. This 25th Anniversary art book is pretty much the biggest source of information when it comes to Fire Emblem 64. It's also where all that awesome character concept art comes from that I've been showing throughout. It's pretty much the only reliable and substantial source when looking into anything related to Fire Emblem 64. Though it is also worth mentioning that some sources state that the screenshot of Fire Emblem 64, that one sole screenshot, was available and shown through a Shoshinkai event while the game was in development. I'm not sure if this claim is true or if the facts are mixed up, but that is worth pointing out in the case that it was. 6. The very last thing we know about Fire Emblem 64, another detail revealed by the handy dandy, The Making of Fire Emblem, 25th Anniversary, Development Secret, is that FE64, and yes, I'm abbreviating it now when I'm almost done with this segment, eventually became Fire Emblem The Binding Blade. And I bet you couldn't have guessed that with how many times I mentioned BB so far, and yep, abbreviating that one too, even though it's hard to confuse it with Blazing Blade, but whatever! Though, despite the fact that there is a lot of clear evidence that the game did eventually become The Binding Blade, there are some that have even speculated that Fire Emblem 64 eventually became Path of Radiance instead and not Binding Blade. Though the confirmation in the anniversary book kind of confirms that it is now, Binding Blade and not Path of Radiance. It is, however, possible that some assets carried over to Roy's game with others going to Ike's game, but there isn't really anything concrete to prove this theory. Hey guys, it is me in the editing room, or whatever you want to call it, and I just realized, and I have no idea how I missed this when I was actually recording and doing the script, but there's a script, an actual script for Fire Emblem 64, like a tentative one that was made when it was like in the Fire Emblem 64 era of its development, if you will, or whatever I'm saying. I'm not really sure right now, very sleep deprived. But yeah, there's a script, there is a link to it that I'll provide in the description. There's also an English translation of it. You're probably looking at it right now too, but yep, forgot to add that. I guess that's number 9 on my list or whatever this is. So yeah. Much like many games created for, or at the very least planned for the 64DD, Fire Emblem 64 ended up being very ambitious. So much so that the hardware it was being developed for just couldn't handle it. Shozo Kaga himself even admitted this in 1999, while also saying that the next game in development in the Fire Emblem series was now Tracia 776 rather than 64. Very difficult game, by the way. This was unfortunately the end of the line, as later that year in 64 Dream magazine, Fire Emblem 64 was confirmed to be officially cancelled. If Fire Emblem 64 came out on the 64DD, it could have possibly rivaled RPGs like Final Fantasy VII. I mean, that's a long shot because back in that era, Final Fantasy VII was pretty huge and pretty expansive, which, you know, that's why it was on the PlayStation and not on the Nintendo 64, just because it's a very big and very ambitious game for the time period. It did not age well, but it was huge back then. So I mean, take my hot take here with a grain of salt, but I really do think if this game came out, like as far as 3D RPGs back then, I think it could have had like, you know, positive reception and just a lot of interest in it just because it's a 3D RPG. And, you know, we never truly saw a release 3D Fire Emblem until the GameCube era, and at that point there were plenty of 3D RPGs. So I mean, if it came out a little earlier, like a 3D Fire Emblem, I think it would have made a big impact, and that's just my opinion, of course. As it stands, I mean, again, it's a big shame this game never came out. But again, I mean, I stand for Fire Emblem in just general, and it's a big shame just to me because I have that bias. The Pokemon games, more specifically the mainline Pokemon RPG games, have always been a portable affair until very recently with the release of Sword and Shield versions in 2019. This has always been completely intentional, as Junichi Masuda, one of Game Freak's founders, has always been clear on wanting the games to be a social experience and having the mechanisms of the main Pokemon titles revolve around human interaction as players battle and trade Pokemon together. Though, you know, that didn't really stop me from being a total introvert as I played these games as a kid. Still kinda am. But here's where it gets interesting. See, way back in the early days of Pokemon, way back when we were still in the Gen 1 Game Boy days, there were plans for a Pokemon RPG to be released on the 64DD add-on. And if you're thinking this isn't a big deal or anything because, you know, home console Pokemon games do exist, then I should probably mention that this game would have been a mainline RPG, not a spin-off. And that it would have been developed by Game Freak themselves. While games like Pokemon Colosseum and XD are home console RPGs in the Pokemon series, they do count as spin-offs. These two games don't really have much in terms of world exploration and are pretty battle-focused. They were developed by Genius Sonority, a company known for developing various Pokemon spin-offs among other games. Even early Pokemon spin-off games such as Stadium and Snap were not developed by Game Freak, as both games were worked on by HAL Laboratory. Stadium was also worked on by Nintendo EAD. My point to all of this is that when Game Freak works on a Pokemon title, it's always a mainline RPG. And yes, if we're getting very specific and nitpicking here, Game Freak did work on Pokemon Quest, but I feel like that's kind of the one single outlier here. And also, yes, I know they're not working on the Diamond and Pearl remakes, but I feel like that's kind of an equivalent exchange kind of deal, since Game Freak's working on the Legends Arceus game, and that's a whole other thing, and we're getting off topic. And now that I got y'all up to speed and got all that build-up out of the way, let's talk about Pocket Monsters RPG. And when I say build-up, I really mean build-up because most of this is gonna be build-up because there's really barely anything known about this game other than the title. Actually, that's basically it. So, to begin, with a lot of lost and obscure 64DD stuff, there's usually some kind of Space World or Shoshinkai announcement, though this one never really saw one or any announcement at all, really. Pocket Monsters RPG was named and mentioned briefly in 1997 in an Electronic Gaming Monthly interview with Shigeru Miyamoto. In this interview, he stated that 10 people were working on the project and that it would be on 64DD. He also said they weren't sure if the game would see a release outside Japan. What's also interesting is that other Pokemon spin-offs were originally planned for a 64DD release as well. This includes the Stadium games, and by Stadium games I mean the 1 and 2 in Japan, not the 2 with the Gen 2 Pokemon, Hey You Pikachu, and Snap. They were all planned for the peripheral before being moved to a standard N64 cartridge release. Unfortunately, it seems that Pocket Monsters RPG was the only game out of that batch to not make the cut and make an official release as a video game, as it just kind of fell into obscurity after being mentioned that one time in the 1997 interview. At that year's Space World event, only Snap and Stadium were showed off and there was nothing on the RPG at all. Not even a single mention of it from what I can find. The game was silently and unofficially cancelled after that one brief mention. There are various reasons why the game was cancelled, and among the most likely may be Masuda's belief that Pokemon RPGs should only be on portable consoles. There's also the fact that Gold and Silver versions were in development at the same time, with a Space World demo being available to play at that same 1997 show that Snap and Stadium were shown off at. I'm not an expert on game development by any means at all, but it would likely have been pretty difficult to create a 3D Pokemon RPG with only 10 people on board. It's likely that most people at Game Freak were just too busy with Gold and Silver at the time, and that was their main focus. It's also possible that the 10 people involved in creating Pocket Monsters RPG at that time could have just been in the brainstorming phase, creating concept artwork and just kind of going over what this game was going to be about and like the length of how ambitious it would be. It's really unknown what the 10 people were doing as far as development on that game. And of course, another likely reason for cancellation could be that the 64DD was delayed so much and sold so poorly when it eventually came out. While the other spin-offs could be adjusted to fit into the 64 carts, it's possible that they couldn't make that work for a full-on RPG, as this also happened with Mother 64 and Fire Emblem 64. These games were just too big and advanced to compress them and make them worthwhile. I don't think compression's the technical word for that, I just mean making it smaller to fit on the cartridge. Maybe it is, I don't know. Because we really don't know anything at all about Pocket Monsters RPG, we really have no idea what it would have looked like, what the story and setting would be, if it would incorporate Gen 2 at all, if it would have been a whole new region or Kanto in 3D, or if any of the scrap features made it into later Pokemon games. In my humble opinion, I don't think this game made it too far in development. There's probably some concept art hidden away, and possibly a very, very early build, but we really have no idea and absolutely nothing to go off of to really give us a hint at how far this game was. Though, I will say that we did recently see that Gold and Silver Space World demo get leaked fairly recently, and while I certainly do not condone the act of leaking company property without the proper permission and consent, the same thing could possibly happen in the future with Pocket Monsters RPG. I mean, L did end up being real after all. All that aside, the future of the Pokemon RPG series does look pretty bright, as we do have some promising, kinda technically home RPGs coming out soon, with Legends and the Gen 4 remakes. And I do know that Let's Go and the Sword and Shield games do count as well, though a lot of people have their reservations and very strong opinions and feelings about Sword and Shield, and let's just not get into that, okay? Let's just think about happy things like new Pokemon Snap. That game is amazing, and my point here is that the future of Pokemon as far as home console RPGs looks pretty great, and while we never saw Pocket Monsters RPG, we do have a lot of stuff to look forward to right now. As a matter of fact, let me know if you're excited for either of those games, or love Pokemon Snap, new Pokemon Snap actually, specifically. And yeah, just let me know in the comments below. If you want, of course. Osamu Tezuka is a famous creator of manga and anime. So much so that he is commonly known as the father of manga. While he is not known for video games, there have been a few video games made that are based off his works. These range from Famicom releases to current releases on the Nintendo Switch. With all of the iconic creations of Tezuka, there is a lot of potential for video games. This especially goes for Emperor of the Jungle, a game intended for release on the 64DD. Osamu Tezuka passed away in 1989. After his passing, control of Tezuka Productions was given to his children, namely his son, Makoto Tezuka. It was in the mid-90s when Nintendo, namely Shigeru Miyamoto, began working with Makoto Tezuka to try and adapt the manga Jungle Emperor Leo into a Nintendo 64DD video game. This is a 1950s manga and 1960s anime series. Jungle Emperor Leo is also known as Kimba the White Lion in the West. Much like Cabbage, the virtual pet simulator game that was cancelled on the 64DD, Emperor of the Jungle was another project that Shigeru Miyamoto was very passionate about. It was a project that he oversaw the development of himself. Emperor of the Jungle was revealed at Shoshinkai 1996, and very brief footage was shown a year later at Space World 1997. Future me is probably playing that on screen right now in a loop or something because it's just that brief. Later on, a release window of spring of 1999 was given. It was at this point in time where it wasn't exactly confirmed if the game would be on 64DD just yet, as the original announcement didn't really specify. It doesn't look like much by today's standards, but considering the fact that this game was shown 1 year after Mario 64 was released, and how that game basically laid the foundation for all 3D platforming games to come after it, it's pretty impressive. I mean, just look at the water physics. They don't look very good now, but they're really impressive for like mid-90s water, because water wasn't very good looking in, early polygonal era stuff. So this brings us to what we actually know about the project, and unfortunately that is not really much at all. You could say that information regarding this game is very sparse. Very little is another way to communicate how sparse and not existent information on this game is. Basically, we don't have much aside from that one clip. Though, that one clip does detail Kimba, Leo, or whatever you want to call him, running around a jungle, encountering a skunk, and crossing a river. There's also an elephant. It's kinda cute. By the looks of it, this game would have likely been some form of platformer or even adventure game like a Zelda type of thing. It may have even had some RPG elements tossed in there, I don't know. Most sources I come across describe it as an adventure game though. I mean, one could even go as far as describe it as a 3D version of the Lion King game on the SNES and Genesis Mega Drive, because, they're just so similar and stuff. That's a whole other beast in itself, though. Probably shouldn't have went there. We also know that this game was going to be a faithful adaptation of the original series, and that Nintendo wanted to work very closely with Tezuka's heir to really ensure that this game was as faithful as possible. I know I kind of touched upon this earlier, but it's really clear from all the sources I've read that Nintendo just really wanted to make sure this was a very faithful rendition, probably going over at least one big story arc in the actual series. Also, there is this old IGN article. This probably means as much as all the other old IGN articles around this time about canceled games, such as Fire Emblem 64. I mean, what even was a Fire Emblem back then? Most people didn't know. What's a Fire Emblem? And my point here is that this really, even though they translated this to English, this really says nothing about whether or not this game would have been localized. I mean, all versions of the Jungle Emperor Leo anime, even the 2009 one, have been localized and dubbed in the past, though, and there was a new film following up on the original series that did release in 1997, so it is possible that this game was originally meant to release around the same time as that movie. But we really don't know, and I mean, this is really a poor argument as to whether or not this game that never came out at all would have been, localized. All that article basically says, though, is that this game was planned and that they were working with the Tezuka production company and they just wanted it to be really faithful, and then the article even goes into explaining the plot of the anime and series and whatnot in case, Western readers didn't know, but that's really it. So, aside from brief articles and brief Shoshinkai and Space World appearances, there was never even a playable demo, and not much was heard of the game at all after the short video and the announcement itself. Nothing was really heard until E3 1998 when Miyamoto was asked about the project. And upon being asked about this game, he unfortunately said that the game ran into some trouble during development and claimed that it would be out later than expected due to inexperience. What Miyamoto meant by inexperience is not entirely clear, though the IGN article says the producer had no experience in making video games. Unseen64 goes into more detail and states that Makoto Tezuka was too busy with other projects and was inexperienced in making video games. Miyamoto also wanted Makoto to direct the project, which also didn't end up working out. The game was silently cancelled shortly after this interview, and it's not clear how long the game was in development. It is my personal opinion that there is likely a lot more to this game that we just haven't seen. Maybe something even playable. It would be really cool to see Nintendo attempt to make this game on a modern hardware peripheral thing, like the Switch. While unlikely, it would be very impressive and more people would be familiar with the source material considering how many Western manga and anime fans there are today compared to the 90s. In the end, Emperor of the Jungle is a really cool and obscure and not really well known or talked about piece of 64DD history that I think deserves more attention for how advanced it looks. Ura Zelda is an interesting case because this one may either be found, available, etc., or may still remain lost in its original form. I'll go ahead and let you guys come to your own conclusion regarding that. After hearing all the info I'm bringing forward to you guys today, let me know if you think this game still remains lost in the comments below and stuff. I'm really bad at asking people to comment and subscribe. So, The Legend of Zelda: Ocarina of Time. It's a pretty advanced and groundbreaking game from the N64 era that I'm sure many of you already are well aware of. I know I've been saying this a lot with the other N64 and DD games, but this game was really before its time if you look at the predecessor, Link to the Past, on the Super Nintendo, and just look what a big step it took with the open world exploration and Epona and all that stuff. Like, the targeting system, the way you sword fight with the villains and stuff, none of that existed before Ocarina, and it's probably why it's one of the best games of all time. But, fun fact for you, Ocarina was actually originally meant to be a 64DD title, back when it was being developed and under the tentative title Zelda 64. Probably around the time when they had that little video thing and Link looked like old Link. I don't know how to describe it, I'll just put it on the screen. Though, after moving the game over to the cart format, there was an expansion in the works that was intended to make use of the 64DD technology and expanded memory. Much like the F-Zero X expansion kit and how they had all that cool additional stuff. Though, unfortunately, there were no plans to add a cool dungeon creator to Ura Zelda. I mean, we did get one in Link's Awakening remake, and I think it's pretty alright. So, Ura Zelda, also known as Another Zelda, as this expansion has been called and known by, originally came about during the development of Ocarina of Time. While the game was originally going to be much smaller in scale, so much so that the Castle Hub World in Mario 64 was originally meant to be the Ocarina Hub World early on in development, this did not happen in Mario 64. There's another fun fact that roughly ties into what I'm saying. Though this whole castle thing came about due to Miyamoto underestimating what the N64 was capable of. After becoming more familiar with the hardware, the game became more open and elaborate, as we know it today. So, from my understanding and research, Ura Zelda was meant to be a post-game expansion that added more dungeons, bosses, items, and even NPCs to the world of Hyrule. And this wasn't meant to be a brief DLC-type add-on either. Ura Zelda was supposedly going to be a whole new game that simply reused the same properties as Ocarina, but in a new way. Does that sound familiar? Additions speculated to be included in the Ura expansion include Ice and Wind temples. This content is thought to have been scrapped ideas from the original game. Other speculated elements of Ura Zelda include, well, let me just list them off because there's actually a lot. New temples and quests. New items. Cool sword beam attack thing. Shonat Shoshinkai. The ability to have the Triforce as a physical item. A unicorn fountain. New enemies. New bosses. New cutscenes and graphics. And also, while I don't really know how to say this one in a perky announcer voice, there was also this element of things getting cut and damaged throughout the game and just staying cut and damaged. Proof of this one is actually found in the Code of Ocarina, as it's possible to find a cuttable bush when using a Game Shark. So, if you cut bushes and signs, they would say cut. There are also other speculated features, but these are the most prominent ones that are the most speculated and thought to actually have been a thing in Ura Zelda in development. Again, they're mostly speculated by fans and not confirmed in any way to be present in the actual add-on, though I will say that all of these are very plausible and have very valid reasoning. The new areas and dungeons element was specifically mentioned in an IGN interview in 1998. And in addition to that, there's also remnants of Ura Zelda in Ocarina's code. This includes the title screen for Ura Zelda, or at least the possible title screen. Look at it. It's beautiful. According to Miyamoto, and gosh, we sure use that phrase a lot when talking about 64DD stuff, don't we? Ura Zelda was completely finished. It wasn't just a scrap project that didn't work out or just became too advanced to develop. Nope, Ura Zelda was apparently a finished product that just never saw a release. Or did it? This brings us to Exhibit A, which is the Nintendo GameCube release of Legend of Zelda: Ocarina of Time. That included a little bonus titled Master Quest. This 2003 release was a bonus with pre-ordered copies of the Wind Waker. According to Nintendo, Master Quest is apparently Ura Zelda in its released form. While this could possibly be the case, fans don't see how this adds up. As in, they literally don't see how it adds up. You see, Ura Zelda was meant to be a patch that provided additional game features and data that could fit into an N64 cart. Now, when looking at Master Quest and Ocarina's ROM file sizes, it does become apparent that both files are roughly the same size in megabits. So yeah, quite literally does not add up. There's also the whole thing where Master Quest doesn't include a lot of features said to be in Ura Zelda. This includes the additional enemies that were teased back when it was being developed on the 64DD, and all pretty much the things I named earlier are just not in the game. I have personally heard people describe Master Quest as more of a remix of Ocarina and not at all what people envisioned Ura Zelda to actually be. And just to clarify, I have never played Master Quest myself. I personally don't know how it differs from Ocarina, and those prices on eBay really prevent me from going out of my way to really find out for myself. But as far as hearsay and what I have heard from Zelda fans, it's nothing like what they expected from Ura Zelda. Now, this information by no means proves that Master Quest isn't Ura Zelda. While we do know the add-on was pretty much completed, or at the very least, very close to completion, at the very least, it is likely that some elements were just cut from the final product or not completely ready when they decided to put Master Quest with the Ocarina add-on thing. So, I mean, maybe it was on short notice, maybe they just didn't have time to get everything together. It's really all up in the air and we really have no idea whatsoever. But that does not stop the internet from theorizing and doing other stuff. Like that kind of sort of huge leak last year in 2020 that just kind of sort of leaked a ton of stuff we've never seen before that was supposed to be in Ocarina, various assets that never made it to the final game. It is very likely that some of this stuff that we did see was meant to be in Ura Zelda. Like at least a little teeny bit, like one little thing at least. That would be pretty likely, I think. There is also the very likely possibility that a lot of the unseen elements that weren't leaked or shown in any way just made it to future Zelda games. Eiji Aonuma himself even confirms that specific area of speculation in this statement. Oh, and this was an interview about Breath of the Wild, by the way. In order to create a more cohesive storyline, we added this element in there that will make it a bit more streamlined for every player. This is something I can't reveal right now, but when you play it, you will find out. This idea that I am talking about is actually something I came up with when I first started developing the games. I have been harvesting this idea for 20 plus years. I want to say this is the Wind Glider, maybe, or teleportation, or even the Sheikah Slate in itself, but I'm probably wrong. So, unfortunately, we really don't know what the pure, unadulterated 64DD form of Ura Zelda looks like. We may never see it. Ultimately, Ura Zelda was cancelled quietly in 1999, which was likely due to the constant delays of the 64DD itself, as well as the unreliability of the product due to its very, very late release. This information can be somewhat inferred from that 1998 IGN article. And while we may never see the original Ura Zelda, there is hope to play and see something similar. Something impressively similar. While not the true Ura Zelda, this brings us to the Ura Zelda Restoration Project, or technically projects. It all started in 2013 when someone known as ZethN64 got a group together to restore and rebuild Ura Zelda with all the information they knew regarding the original project. One interesting detail is that the project would have had a different protagonist, one who was not Link. No, not like that. And this whole new protagonist deal was not an element, at least to my knowledge, that was in the Ura Zelda development process or any information given, so it's an interesting touch given by the developers during the recreation. The first attempt at restoring and creating Ura Zelda was eventually cancelled by ZethN64, the one who created it, though the project has been recently picked back up. And by recently, I mean 5 years ago, but hey, it's kind of recent. The Ura Zelda Restoration Project was picked back up in 2016 by someone by the name of Alex S. They plan to get a team together and pick up where the original restoration left off. This specific restoration project is titled Another Restoration of Ura Zelda. So, best of luck to Alex S. and his team, and I really do hope they can get the project completed this time around. There are some videos on YouTube showing what had been finished and established during development of the first original restoration, and it's very impressive. It would really be so awesome if they could get this project finished and appreciated by Zelda fans. Many fans who may not have heard of Ura Zelda or would really love to play something similar to it. It may be the best interpretation and the best thing we may ever get of this decades-long mystery. Or, Master Quest could be Ura Zelda and that's just what they had finished. We honestly, again, will never know, and that's just part of the mystery. Super Mario 64. If you had a Nintendo 64 growing up, or at all, chances are you owned or at least played this game. I mean, it basically did write the book on 3D platformers, after all. What you haven't played, unless you are a very lucky Nintendo employee in the 1990s, or know the even luckier person who found this prototype by chance, is Super Mario Disc version. And among all of the Lost Media I have covered on my channel thus far, this one and the way it was found is very interesting, so be sure to stick around and hear about it in just a second. So let's begin with L. Is L real? Yes he is. As a matter of fact, here he is now. Say hi to him. This is a rumor that had been going on for years. People had speculated that Luigi was an intended playable character since, well, practically since Mario 64 was officially known to the public. When the game was released with the Nintendo 64 console in 1996, Luigi was ultimately not in the game as a playable character. So, with the release of the actual game and no green pasta man to be found, was that really it? Well, to many it was. But what if it wasn't? What if Green Pasta Man, also known as Green Mario or Luigi, was meant to be included eventually in a special add-on with more memory, enhanced visuals, and other possible stuff? Really, this game was barely mentioned, let alone confirmed to exist at all in the West. The only real source confirming it in the English language was an IGN article, surprise surprise, that lists it as an upcoming release. The real kicker is that the game was not listed as Super Mario Disc version. It was listed at, and here's the wild plot twist coming your way, Super Mario 64 2. And I mean, I was thinking of making a separate thing for this one being the Mario 64 2 thing, but upon further research, I believed them to be the very same game due to some confusion with reports during development. And so, this brings us to the Japanese coverage of this game. Famitsu, a popular Japanese gaming magazine that covers Nintendo-related content, claimed that sources working on this game had claimed that the game was intended to be a sequel to Mario 64 2. So, basically, it's a claim of a claim. I don't know if it was a possible mistranslation or some confusion on IGN's part, or possibly that the game was originally meant to be a sequel and changed to an enhanced version of the original. It's all really completely unknown. Nope, we really don't know much about this, but the intended game did end up being an enhanced port. Maybe. And how do we know this? Well, viewer who likely didn't verbally ask me how, I am so glad you asked. Or didn't. Either way. So, years go by and Super Mario Disk System was never announced and it faded into obscurity. That is, until June of 2014 when a prototype of the game suddenly surfaced. And how did this surface? A massive gigaleak? Private collector? Surprisingly enough, the game was discovered by complete chance by a French collector. Of all places, this game, along with the 64DD itself, was discovered at a second-hand shop in Japan. That's right, person who asked the question but probably didn't ask any questions at all. It was just there, out in the open, at a second-hand store in Japan. And honestly, talk about an incredible find. While the store likely had no idea how rare this prototype was, or any idea of where it actually came from and how it ended up there, who donated it, all that stuff, the collector who purchased it likely did. Actually, they definitely did. This collector, known online as Jimmy130 or AFONIJV or FONJIV, either one, posted about his find on his blog and later uploaded footage of the actual game he found on YouTube. So it's definitely a prototype. You can really tell that by how the label looks, the, whole not finalized looking of it and all, and a few details found within this prototype itself. For one, it's definitely not a sequel, as it's just Mario 64 with a few small differences as well as some bugs. These differences and bugs include improved textures, different music in Peach's castle, different title screen, surprisingly without the iconic Mario head, slower loading times, and some bugs, quite literally if I do say so myself, when encountering the Wiggler boss in Tiny Huge Island. Other than that, it's pretty much the same as the original Mario 64, just slower and a little prettier and a little more buggy with some different music. Now, while this does shed a whole lot of light on what this game was supposed to be, there is a lot of information that is still unknown. For one, we know nothing about the prototypes that were possibly created before this one, or if any other prototypes were created after with more improvements and features. I mean, the whole L is real thing did end up being, well, real. And while it's only speculation whether this was a feature in this version, it's certainly a possibility considering that the possibility of Luigi in Mario 64 was definitely a possibility. Though the possibility that Super Mario Disk System not being intended for a release is also a possibility of being a possibility and probably possible to be possible. Now you may have yet another question for me, and that question may be, what would this game be other than intended for release, you may be asking? Well, other likely reasoning for the existence of this disc would be that it's simply just a tech demo. Being that it's so undeniably similar to the original Mario 64, the purpose of this disc could just be to show off what the 64DD could do graphically. This could have been something intended to show off to other media outlets or at a Space World one year. Though the purpose of Super Mario Disk System is truly still unknown. Either way, this thing seems incomplete and definitely not meant to be seen by the public in the state it's in. Despite that, it's a pretty cool find that could have been easily lost if not being found by the right person. And in case anyone is interested in seeing this game in all its glory, code and all, it has been made available on 64dd.org. The Cutting Room Floor has also compiled an interesting article for this prototype as well. While this prototype is still a mystery as far as intentions of where it could have gone, it's definitely a very interesting and cool piece of Nintendo history and an excellent find. Anyone listening ever play Mario Paint? If you did, I bet you used that music editor with the cat and the Game Boy and the dog noises a whole lot like I did, or at least I hope so, because the SNES cat music is a beautiful gift that should be used properly and very much so often and stuff. On stuff like this. Those are dogs, but you see my point. So, back when I first discovered Mario Paint personally, home computers were already a thing. But even so, MS Paint had nothing on what Mario Paint could do. I mean, it had Mario stamps! It was a fun and interesting little game with a lot of features and polish. Specifically, Nintendo polish. It was a cool little part of my childhood, and I think it's really nifty. But yeah, Mario Paint, it's an SNES game, so why are we talking about it? This is about 64DD stuff, right? I mean, that's what you thought when you clicked on it, right? Well, in Japan, on our very obscure and unsuccessful friend the 64DD, who is trying their darndest, there was a partially released sequel to Mario Paint. Or rather, multiple sequels. Some released, some not released. As in plural sequels of the released and not released variety. And let me tell you that they had a lot of potential to do a lot of cool stuff for the time period. This included drawing, 3D animation, an early incarnation of Mii's, though not the first incarnation of Mii's, and the ability to upload your creations online via Randnet. So, like DeviantArt, but not. DeviantArt does have some amazing art though, so don't stereotype it based on the other stuff. But yeah, getting back to finishing my thought here, these games are part of the Mario Artist series, released throughout 1999 and 2000. A lot of the stuff in these games is pretty cool and goes into more than just the simple painting tools you'd see in MS Paint. Okay, so let's go into the features of each game a bit and then discuss the unreleased ones. There were 4 released Mario Artist titles and 4 unreleased. The first entry being the standard Mario Artist Paint Studio, released in December of 1999, and it's very much what you would expect from Mario Paint. The interface is updated and there's a little more flexibility with your tools and what you can do in it. IGN personally describes it as Photoshop for kids. And like the original Mario Paint, there is the option to stamp on various video game characters, including rare ones like Banjo, and all of the first generation Kanto Pokemon. Images could also be imported from a capture cartridge, another add-on that connected through the RCA source of the console, or the Game Boy camera was also another option. The Game Boy camera data was transferred via the transfer pack you plugged into the controller. You know, that thing used for Pokemon Stadium that I personally thought only had that one singular use of transferring Pokemon until researching for this video. Like the Randnet kit, the Mario Artist Paint Studio had a bundle little kit variant available with the Nintendo 64 mouse controller. And there was also co-op drawing. That's right, folks, your possible niche dream of collaborating with 3 other people on Mario Paint on a Nintendo 64 console add-on was now made possible. Much like the original Mario Paint, the animation feature was brought back as well. In Paint Studio, it allowed for animations up to 35 frames long. There was also a 3D world that the player could explore and take photos of. This feature has been described to be very similar to Pokemon Snap, except, you know, no Pokemon. Like I said, this release was well released. There was, however, a prototype that was discovered on a blue disc. This prototype had the Fly Swatter game that SNES Mario Paint had. It's a little updated though, and the room looks like Mickey Mouse's house in Toontown, and it's kinda weird. Like a cool weird. And if you'd like more info on the prototype, please check out these videos by Hard4Games and Luigi Blood. And there's also some other pre-release screens available for your viewing pleasure. Here they are. So there's your little tour of Paint Studio. Next, we're gonna go ahead and look at Talent Studio. Also unrelated, but look at these descriptions on the 64DD Wiki. Who wrote this? Who hurt you, 64DD Wiki? Also, here's a micro-Japanese kind of culture lesson for you guys. While the word talent in the Talent Studio title does in fact refer to the textbook definition of the word talent, this game is mainly revolving around the Japanese tarento industry, which is like a TV personality. Like someone who specializes in being a television tarento rather than an actor, idol, singer, etc. Much like idols are prepped to be idols, tarento are kinda prepped for a specific type of work as well. That certainly doesn't mean that they can't double dip in other realms of entertainment though, and many people have in the past. And there are a lot of examples of this that I could name, but the one I can think of right off the top of my head as I'm talking right now is Tetsuko Kuroyanagi. She's a prominent figure in Japanese media, especially television, for almost 7 decades now. Not a household name here in the West or wherever you may be, but if you're in Japan, then she pretty much is. And there's your mini lesson. So the game is an animation program, but goes even more in depth than Paint Studio did. As I said earlier with the Mii's and whatnot, Talent Studio had an early variant of Mii's in that you can put people's faces on 3D models. Talent Studio has a variety of scenarios you can insert your character into, and they all have the same amount of silliness and cheesiness that one would expect from Miitopia or Tomodachi Life. There was also this oddly specific feature that let the player import their avatar from the game SimCity 64 in order to have it live in the in-game city as a background character. So, kind of like your Miis, how they show up in Mario Kart Wii, I guess. That's really it with Talent Studio. This game was also bundled in a kit that included that capture cassette we discussed. This lets you import or export content like photos and videos. You could also import audio with the microphone the game was also bundled with. Going back to the Mii stuff, there was also later an unreleased GameCube prototype that resembled Talent Studio. It was titled Stage Debut, and was yet another precursor to Mii's. Next we got Polygon Studio. So, can I just start by saying that the 3D animation in this one is especially awesome. I mean, sure, it is definitely limited, but I don't think people had access to this kind of software regularly unless they bought one of those big chonkers like Lightwave or Maya. And don't quote me on that, by the way, I'm not really sure if that's the case, but you know, for a game console, it's pretty cool. And aside from the 3D animation thing, there was also minigames. As a matter of fact, a few minigames found in Polygon Studio were later reused in the WarioWare games. So, what does Polygon Studio do aside from this? It also had the feature of sharing and receiving 3D models. You could have your models made into a papercraft figure by using a feature in Randnet, and honestly, that sounds really cool. I can't find any photos of how that worked and what the product looked like if it printed out and what it looked like finished, but I would love to see one if one exists online in the wild. The feature of sending and receiving models was also a feature made possible by purchasing the fourth and final released entry in the Mario Artist series. This was the communication kit. And as the name suggests, it was a communication kit to communicate. And as I defined the word talent previously, the word communication is defined as... I'm kidding, could you imagine if I did that? But yeah, long story short, the communication kit is just a kit to connect the Mario Artist releases to Randnet. This kit would have been used in the 4 other Mario Artist titles, probably. That is, if they weren't cancelled. And with that awesome segue comes the unreleased titles. Now, because these games were unreleased, there's not much known about them. We do have titles though. The 4 unreleased games are Mario Artist Game Maker, Mario Artist Graphical Message Maker, Mario Artist Sound Maker, and Luigi Artist. No, I'm kidding, it's Mario Artist Video Jockey Maker. Now, some of these may sound pretty self-explanatory, while others not so much. Like Graphical Message Maker. What is that? Polygono PictoChat? I honestly wouldn't be surprised if it was, but we have no idea what it is pretty much. But like most, or pretty much all of the unreleased 64DD games, there's a late 90s IGN article to accompany them. Which is good, because that's pretty much all we have for these. But they're mostly just announcements of the unreleased games, particularly Video Jockey, Graphical Message, and Game Maker. The information that accompanies these announcements is pretty much just speculation and wondering what these games could be, and, you know, kind of throwing a little shade at them in the meantime. That's really it. Much like mysterious titles like Cabbage, the titles of these unreleased games really just show up on lists of upcoming titles and not much else. These lists actually make me kinda sad. While the games like Wall Street on this list don't exactly get me pumped, it's kind of a bummer to see a lot of the other cool stuff that we eventually never saw. In conclusion, it's at least cool we were able to see some games released, specifically the first 4 Mario Artist titles. So, we've mentioned Metroid fans, Earthbound fans, and even F-Zero fans. But there's a certain area of the Mario fanbase that doesn't get much attention either. That being the Mario RPG fanbase, as in Mario RPG The Legend of the Seven Stars. And while some people may have strong opinions on the current state of Paper Mario games, and it's not known if we'll ever see another Mario and Luigi title, the first role-playing game of the Mario variety definitely had the shortest time in the limelight. Being a very late release in the SNES's life cycle and a collaboration between Nintendo and Squaresoft are both contributing factors in this. But yeah, no Geno in Smash, currently no Mario RPG on NSO. Despite being a very short-lived thing, Mario RPG definitely has a fan base, and for good reason. It's actually a really great game. And yes, while again short-lived, it wasn't meant to be that way. As a matter of fact, a sequel was kind of in the works for the 64DD. And this sequel was called, wait for it, Mario RPG 2. Though the game was also referred to as Mario RPG 64 and Super Mario Adventure during development. The game was first announced at Space World 1997, and early concept art of it used one-dimensional Super Mario World sprites, very similar to Paper Mario. You probably see where this is going based on that one statement. The game was mentioned in various magazines, including Nintendo Power, where a reader actually asked the question regarding its development, as well as the development of other familiar series that you may be familiar with. Some of these magazines actually provide really interesting concept art that show what the game looked like throughout various stages of development. While very similar to Paper Mario at all points of its creations, the changes in art style, specifically Mario's design, are pretty distinct and similar to Mario's traditional design. There's a reason for this, probably. While the game was intended for release on the 64DD, as many eventual N64 games were, this game eventually did make it out, but in a different form from how it was initially portrayed. And now you must really see where I'm going with this. See, that very first Mario RPG game, as previously mentioned, was worked on by both Nintendo and Squaresoft, now known as Square Enix. I don't know if I mentioned that previously, but yes, Square Enix, Squaresoft, you get it. While not completely known if Square was involved at any point in RPG 2's development, this early screen of the title screen credits Nintendo and Intelligent Systems for the game. So it is possible that another collab was thought of, maybe mentioned in passing or something, but never actually came about. So, in short, there's not really any information indicating whether or not Square was involved at any point in time, and if so, how involved were they? It's likely they weren't involved at all. Though, we do know some legal issues were involved with Square, and that is what ultimately contributed to the shift in development to the Paper Mario format we know and love today. So we do have photos and screenshots of the artist formerly known as Mario RPG 2, but no actual gameplay or prototypes have been seen by the public. It's unknown how far the early version of Mario RPG 2 got before the change, and if any content was planned and not included when the game was moved from 64DD disc to 64 cart. Though I must say, it is pretty interesting to look at these screenshots and see how a game comes about and how different it can be from the final product. So at least there's that. And just when you thought I was done with all the Nintendo 64 dynamic drive stuff, see, it's not disk drive, it's dynamic drive, and I corrected myself this time. Just when you thought I was done with that, well, guess what? We have just scratched the surface of all the wonderful games there is to offer on this console, or rather, weren't offered. But we'll get to that. Yes, I could go on even longer about the 64DD content and all of that, though this segment is going to be rather short, as the titles I'm going to go over have either been made out in another form or are just smaller release titles. Actually, this may not be a very short segment because there's a lot of unreleased titles or titles that didn't make it out. I mean, none of these titles will likely warrant their own video or segment, and I might as well give them a mention during my big old 64DD extravaganza, so here we go. Let's start with the released games. Released on 64DD, that is, because there's some that were released. We'll get to that. So yeah, released games, here we go. Doshin the Giant, released on 64DD and GameCube. SimCity 64. Japan Pro Golf Tour 64. Doshin the Giant Tinkling Toddler Liberation Front Assemble. What did I just say? And that's literally it for the released games that I have yet to mention that haven't had their own segments. So let's get to unreleased. Let's go! Seventh Legion. Automobile Lamborghini add-on. Communication game. DD Sequencer. Derby Stallion 64. Desert Island No Man's Land. Desaimon 3D expansion kit. Diablo. Interesting. Digital horse racing newspaper. Digital sports newspaper. Doubutsu Bancho. Later released as this. Doubutsu no Mori. I think we all know what happened to this one. Dragon Quest VII. Later released to the PS1. DT Bloodmaster. Far East of Eden, Oriental Blue, released as a GBA title later on. Gendai Dai Senryaku, Ultimate War, converted to cartridge in 2000 and then cancelled. Hybrid Haven, released on cartridge. Kirby 64, The Crystal Shards, released on cartridge. Mario Party 2, released on cartridge of course. Mario no Fotopi, cartridge released without 64DD storage option. Mission Impossible, released on cartridge. Mission Impossible 64DD, I'm assuming that's the same game. Morita Shogi 64, released on cartridge. Mother 3.5, should have put this in my Mother 3 segment, but it's an expansion of Mother 3, presumably. Mysterious Dungeon, converted to cartridge in 2000, released on Nintendo DS, of all things. Namco RPG, no idea what that could be, but likely a Tales game or, Taiko no Tatsujin RPG, of course. Ogre Battle Saga, released on cartridge. Oriental Blue Ao no Tengai, redeveloped and released for Game Boy Advance. Project Cairo, and I really want to put a JoJo reference here because a Stardust Crusaders RPG, wouldn't that be cool? Resident Evil Zero, released on GameCube. Rev Limit, cancelled. Seaman, released on Dreamcast and terrifying. Simcopter 64, cancelled. Snowspeeder, released on cartridge. Street Fighter 3, Dokkan Road Brave Spirits add-on. Unreal, cancelled. Wall Street, cancelled I guess. Ultra Donkey Kong, released on cartridge as Donkey Kong 64. Yoshi's Island 64, released on cartridge as Yoshi's Story. Yosuke Ide's Mahjong School, converted to dual disc cartridge, then cancelled. Zelda 64, released on cartridge as Legend of Zelda Ocarina of Time. Zelda Gaiden, released on cartridge as The Legend of Zelda Majora's Mask. And ladies and gentlemen, buddies and brosifs, that is really it for, as far as my knowledge is concerned, to my knowledge, all the Nintendo 64 DD games that were released or planned to be released or cancelled or moved to something else. And of course there's probably some we don't have any idea of that maybe just didn't make it that far in development or just hidden to the world, but to my knowledge, these are the ones I am aware of. So bask in that knowledge, my friends, bask in all those titles I just threw at you. And with all of that said and considered, I believe I have covered pretty much the most prominent and possible releases for the 64DD. I've wanted to do a series compiling information on obscure Nintendo stuff for a while now, and I hope you all find it informative, entertaining, and/or educational. Now, I am by no means the only person to make a video on the 64DD and the games and all that, so please allow me to provide and credit some additional sources. A lot of great findings, footage, and 64DD info can be found on the Hard4Games YouTube channel. This includes much of the released catalog as well as unreleased findings and footage of the Ura Zelda restoration. I mean, when it comes to the prototype area specifically, they have a lot of excellent content, so be sure to check them out if you have any interest in this add-on. Another great channel is Gaming Historian. While many excellent topics are covered, the 64DD video is especially excellent, so be sure to check that out as well. There's also Yuri of Win's Gaming Mystery series, which has covered a few 64DD titles in the past. And of course, did you know gaming also has a plethora of obscure gaming facts? Their Nintendo 64 episodes have a lot of great 64DD information. And if you want to see what's actually inside the thing, there's also this really cool video by Spawnwave. So, with all of that said, I hope you guys look forward to equally comprehensive videos on SNES Satellaview, Famicom Disk System, Virtual Boy, and Project Atlantis. Ever heard of Project Atlantis? Well, if not, you have now. I pretty much intend to make videos on any Nintendo platform and just kind of discuss all the obscure lost stuff that it has to offer that is currently known to man. So, I've got my work cut out for me.